Good afternoon, everyone. This is Bill Penacavas from the Nonprofit Finance Fund. I want to welcome you to our fourth webinar in our series on pay-for-success financing and social impact bonds. The title of this webinar is The Impact on Service Providers, Opportunities and Challenges of Pay-for-Success Financings and SIB Participation. I'm going to begin with a few logistics and housekeeping items. First of all, just to ensure that all of you are hearing this transmission with clarity, you will see in the dialog box on your screens there is a symbol for a hand. If you can raise your hand to tell us that you can hear us by clicking on that symbol, we'll get a test of our transmission. So if you could please do that now. Thank you. The next piece of this is that there will be a Q&A session following the three presentations. You can submit your questions at any time by typing them into the box that also is in your dialog box and sending them in to us. They will be scrolling into us throughout the presentations in the webinar, but do feel free to do that at any time as you're listening in on the presentations. We did get some questions that were submitted when people registered, and a couple of folks asked a fairly basic question, which was, where can I find out more about social impact bonds and pay-for-success financing? So I'm going to take just a second here to go through a few of those things. So if you happen to miss any of our previous three webinars, they are available at our Pay-for-Success and Social Impact Bond Learning Hub. You can access that by going to payforsuccess.org or nffsib.org to see all of the resources on this important topic, including articles and videos, webinars, web chats, event listings, and a member directory. You can also go to payforsuccess.org and nffsib.org to sign up to become a member of the Social Impact Bond Learning Hub. And if you are a service provider, you can also access that Learning Hub to take a self-assessment questionnaire to inventory your organization's readiness to act as an SIB PFS service provider. You also, as a service provider, can submit your organization's profile in the Learning Hub's service provider directory. And lastly, on that point, we would be remiss if we weren't mentioning that NFF's Social Impact Bond Learning Hub website, these webinars, and all of NFF's work to support the development of an enabling environment for social impact bonds and pay-for-success financings are generously funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. So about today's webinar, to date the public dialogue on pay-for-success financings and SIB has provided little opportunity for the service provider voice to be heard. In today's webinar, leaders of three high-performing U.S.-based nonprofit organizations representing diverse social missions and service territories will share their thoughts on the opportunities and challenges of participating in pay-for-success and social impact bond projects. So today, we are going to shift away from a discussion of social impact bonds and pay-for-success structure and technical details, away from how to engage governments and satisfy private investors, and instead focus exclusively on the needs, concerns, and requirements of the service providers, those whose delivery of outcomes-driven preventative and early intervention programs are essential to the success of social impact bonds and pay-for-success financings. Today's panelists are Deborah DeSantis, President and CEO of the Corporation for Supportive Housing, Jeff Edmondson, the President of Strive, and Dorothy Stoneman, President and Founder of Youth Build USA. And now I'll turn the presentation over to Deborah DeSantis of the Corporation for Supportive Housing.
Thank you, Bill. And let me start out by thanking NFF for this opportunity to share CSH's early thinking about pay-for-success and social impact bond instruments, and also for the opportunity to learn from our peers. So actually, could you go back to the first slide? Thank you. CSH is a national nonprofit organization that works throughout the country to assist communities and government that are interested in developing affordable housing with services, or what we refer to as supportive housing, as a way to address homelessness. And so what we do in communities is we function as a lender. We provide technical assistance to build provider capacity. And we also advocate at the federal and local level to advance supportive housing programs. Next slide, please. Supportive housing has been proven to be a cost-effective combination of permanent affordable housing with services that help people live more stable, productive lives. And this really is our interest in exploring the Pay for Success and SIB instruments. I believe strongly that for a provider or an intermediary like CSH to be successful in this arena, you're really going to have to be able to tell your story. And our story is about the cost effectiveness of supportive housing. And I think that's that cost effectiveness piece that will resonate with investors. Our interest in pursuing these structures is also goes to the fact that we believe this opportunity provides a good means of helping government reform the way they think about investing in outcomes and organizations. And we think that for supportive housing anyway, it will be another means of funding services. We're thinking about both of these structures in two ways. As a national intermediary, we see ourselves functioning possibly as a lead contract agent for a SIB structure, but we also see ourselves functioning as a content expert. An example of that is our partnership with Social Finance in Boston. Social Finance responded to the RFI in Massachusetts, and what we're doing is advising them on the structure of a potential SIB that would focus on both the individual homelessness and family homelessness in Massachusetts as the state works to transform both of those systems. Next slide, please. So I included this slide really to illustrate, again, why I think it's important that a provider or an intermediary like CSH have a strong story to tell. This slide goes to the cost effectiveness of supportive housing. And so CSH has either invested in research and evaluations throughout the country, or we have actually done the research ourselves and or have gathered up existing research to really demonstrate and prove the point that it's much more cost effective to have someone living in supportive housing than it is to have them on the streets in emergency services or in inappropriate housing. I think that what we've heard thus far from investors, groups looking at the Pay for Success or SIB model really is the importance of looking at the cost side. We know that there's going to be a lot that goes into analyzing the cost savings in these structures. And so I think it's going to be important that groups that get into this arena be able to tell that story, but be able to tell it in a longitudinal way. It's not what were the savings this year. It's really looking backwards to show that there's an argument to be made that there's strong data indicating that over time there is cost savings, and that's what we've done in supportive housing. Next slide, please. When we think about what the challenges and opportunities are for providers getting into this or intermediaries, I think the first thing that comes to mind is capacity. And capacity, I think about metrics first and foremost. And I'll give you an example of metrics. This week, I was touring a supportive housing development serving youth aging out of the foster care system, and the provider was talking about their own metrics, their employment metrics. And over time, they had been reporting their employment metrics, and they were and the metrics indicated very poor outcomes. What they realized, however, was that actually 87% of their residents were employed. And the disconnect was attributed to the fact that what they were actually counting was the number of times their residents came into contact with a caseworker. But they weren't coming into contact with the caseworker because they were actually employed, so they were at work. I think that's a great example of the first thing I think providers need to do is get their house in order. And the priority, I think, is what are the metrics you've been using, how have you been tracking outcomes, and making sure that those outcomes are indeed relevant. The other challenge, I think, or concern that we have is the potential for unrealistic return on interest expectations. And so internally, we really have been emphasizing that pay for success, or SIBs, first and foremost, we want to be involved because we see it as a way to reform how government invests. And then want to be very clear about what those returns actually might look like. Next, you know, similar to metrics, the lack of comprehensive data. So I think it goes beyond an individual organization's internal metrics and is really looking at the social issue more generally. So as I referenced the slide earlier, that was us gathering data throughout the country to demonstrate that the model that we had created and were advancing was working, and that we were proving that through the data. And I think that's going to be important in telling the story. I would also say that groups really need to understand the role of government. I've been in a number of conversations where sometimes it seems like government is an afterthought. I think clearly government is going to be a big driver in this process. And it's going to be important for groups to understand government's role, but also to understand what they can and cannot do and be part of making, I think, really good suggestions for how they can move the ball. And I think that pertains specifically to the way government is funded and thinking about the annualized budgets and what kind of flexibility they have or don't have and what kind of authority they'll be looking to actually enter into a SIB. And then lastly, I'd say just long-term viability. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to be working in a collaborative spirit to make sure that whatever goes forward is successful. I certainly don't want this to fall on its face and be seen as some fly-by-night effort. So it does concern me that sometimes it feels like there's a race to be first in the SIB world. So again, I think this opportunity that NFF has afforded all of us to share our knowledge and share our experience is really important. And so I'm excited about the direction that's going. Again, the opportunities we see is to reform government, whether it's pay for success or SIB. It's really getting government to think differently about outcomes and the organizations that they're funding. That being said, that also means that providers are going to have to step back and understand that government will be looking differently at outcomes, and so they need to understand what those expectations are. And then for us, we see the SIB as a potential new source of funding. In our case, it would be for service funding of supportive housing. And I think for others, that opportunity is there as well. So again, Bill, thank you, and I turn it back to you.
Thank you, Deborah. We're going to turn the program over to Jeff Edmondson of Stride at this point. Jeff?
Great. It's great to have this opportunity, and I'll just be really building on a lot of the insights that Deborah already offered. Before launching in, I just want to give you a really quick overview of Strive and what it is, so that you have a good idea about what it is exactly we do. We promote the development of what we call civic infrastructure in a community to support, in our case, education-related outcomes, to support every child every step of the way from cradle to career. So it isn't we aren't a program delivery mechanism, but an intermediary that is actually looking to support local entities who can help communities go through a process by which they don't create new programs per se, but they actually set some priorities and some outcomes they want to move, and then identify existing resources in their community that are actually already getting results, and then promote investment in those kinds of activities. So the civic infrastructure is really about, consistent with social impact bonds, trying to invest resources in those activities in a given community that are already getting results, or that one would assume will get outstanding results in order to have the most impact on a given community. So if you go to the next slide, this is a busy but example of the type of work we do, and essentially this is pulled from the STRIVE partnership in Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky, where essentially the key community leaders have come together to create a vision of every child, every step of the way, cradle to career, established a mission around supporting that vision, but then setting some big, hairy, audacious goals where you would have every child prepared for school, supported inside, outside school, so on. Then some measures that you would want to track on an ongoing basis, and we put out a report card in this particular community, and then some indicators of success. But really it's the collaborative action example that would relate to social impact bonds, in that it would essentially, around one of the outcomes, so let's say kindergarten readiness, the United Way of Greater Cincinnati, which is really an incredibly visionary organization locally when it comes to organizing community partners to have social impact. They brought together all the major players in early childhood and worked with them to identify what was getting results. And then they pulled together a plan with all these existing providers to have impact on the outcome of moving kindergarten readiness. And they've actually seen over the last 4 years an increase in kindergarten readiness of 9%, and that's really tremendous given the trends that had been in place over the years before. But it's because they invested local dollars. They actually had a significant campaign, not in what they thought might work, but what the data said did work. So having certified teachers in a classroom, or having a low student-teacher ratio. And so the reason that the social impact bonds could resonate with this work of building civic infrastructure, and I think it's worth noting for any of those that may be confused that STRIVE in this case is different than the workforce group that's based in New York City. Some folks have had some confusion about that. But the work of STRIVE in this case about building this civic infrastructure is that social impact bonds could be a way by which intermediaries like STRIVE, there's others in other communities, could potentially drive investment towards those activities that they're able to identify really gets results for kids. So if you go to the next slide, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but if you click through all these different pillars, you can see that we've developed a framework by which a community could build this civic infrastructure. It's not a model, something you want to pick up and drop down, but a framework by which a community could begin to say, you know, we need to focus on early childhood and college access, or we need to focus on 4th grade literacy and college retention as the key priorities in our community based on what the data says. But the reason we're so excited about social impact bonds, if you go on to the next slide, is that the core heart of this work is beginning to think more about social return on investment, of really investing dollars in what gets results for kids, as opposed to the spray and pray mentality of spraying resources all over the place and just praying that good things happen. So the key in our minds around how to make sure that the social impact bonds could have the most impact would be ensuring that there is the capacity in the community to collect, manage, analyze, and report data effectively, because there is often an assumption that just because the data is there, it's actually being used to improve things as opposed to just prove things, which is what typically funding sources have been used, or how funders have used data. And so making sure there's capacity in place to do coaching for individual programs or collaboratives of programs, so that when they have the data, they actually know how to use it on an ongoing basis, not just once, but on an ongoing basis, to actually make improvements. And there's many amazing nonprofits, including those on this call, that actually do this, but it can't be assumed that that's what's happening at scale across an entire community. And then last, on policy, funder, and advocacy, which is consistent with something that Deborah said, that we have found that it's actually hard to shift existing resources towards what actually gets results, because there may be history there that has to be overcome. So support around doing that kind of advocacy. Some recommendations could be that taking a collaborative approach to moving a specific outcome in a community, as opposed to looking to individual programs, may be more beneficial, because when you have multiple programs that bring multiple assets to the table, you may be able to reduce the number of external factors that could impact an outcome. To avoid distractions, especially given how hot SIB is right now, as Deborah noted, if somebody was to get this, there's going to be a lot of pressures. So staying zeroed in on the actual outcome you're looking to move and not letting anything distract from that. But then also ensuring that, you know, a program may get the social impact bond, but the long-term impact or the long-term sustainability is going to depend on whether or not the populations being served are actually interested in the outcome that is being worked towards. So making sure that when you're identifying the outcome, that you have the buy-in of the communities that are actually being served. The last slide. If some opportunities and benefits, I don't need to dwell on this. I think, you know, it's pretty obvious that given the interest in social impact bonds, that it would reinforce this work reinforces the importance of using data, and it can draw attention to really impactful work. And so that in and of itself could be tremendously powerful and help people to begin to think of investments in the social sector more in an investment mentality instead of a charity mentality. And I think that's pretty obvious to most everybody, that it really would help to change the culture of how we invest in social improvements. And then the last piece, the risks and obstacles, would be that because of the high reward of doing something like this, there could be high risk. That if you as Deborah said, if you aim too high, you may essentially be unable to meet expectations, and that could be devastating in some cases. But you may not be able to control for all the external factors if you aim too high, especially if you're working with individual programs as opposed to a more collaborative approach. And then the ability of a program or a collaborative to actually have impact. It does take time in the social sector, and so setting manageable expectations around how quickly and how aggressively you're going to move a specific outcome is important to consider as well. So all in all, the social impact bond concept really could support this idea of taking a more investment-minded approach to improving specific outcomes, and look forward to the question and answer portion.
Thank you, Jeff. We're going to turn the program over to Dorothy Stoneman from Youth Build USA. Dorothy?
I'm going to introduce first the Youth Build program, which was invented in East Harlem in 1978 and went on to replicate and scale, which I'll explain later, but the core description is what's on this slide. It empowers dropouts to complete their high school education in a very supportive, caring, youth-build alternative school, within which counseling, leadership development, and construction training are offered while students build affordable housing, serving their communities and internalizing the positive values of community service. And when they're done after a full-time year in this program, they go on to employment, often in union apprenticeships or college. Next slide, please. And when this program worked so well in East Harlem, it's like a classic social innovation that started locally 33 years ago, and then Youth Build USA took on the role of orchestrating, taking it to scale. We replicated it, we set up data systems, evaluated it, and advocated it for it to become public policy with a national coalition. Succeeded with the support of some political support, bipartisan, in getting it authorized in federal law under first HUD and now the U.S. Department of Labor. We basically gave the name of Youth Build to the federal government. Every year, Congress makes an annual Youth Build appropriation to the U.S. Department of Labor. Then local programs apply directly to U.S. Department of Labor in a national competition, and the funds do not flow through Youth Build USA. We also do not influence selection. It's a federal program. But then Youth Build USA competes every few years to become the provider of training and TA for the government to their Youth Build grantees. And then we work in the public-private partnership to supplement the Department of Labor funds with other public and private funds for catalytic innovation and movement building impact and leadership development, and bringing this network together so that we can retain a sense of movement and long-term commitment to impact and not become a typical government program that loses that passion. Next slide, please. And that's worked very well for us. So there are now 273 Youth Build programs in the United States. There are 14 other countries asking to do it, and many of them doing it, and 100,000 young people have been through the program, and the data shows that at least $7.80 are returned in value for every dollar spent on a Youth Build program. So since we have an optimal going to scale system all set up, the question would be, well, why are we interested in the social impact bonds and the pay for success approach? And the social impact bonds, frankly, at first made me suspicious that it was dangerous in that it could further privatize or profitize the public sector in ways that actually would not benefit the taxpayer, because the investors would have to get some profit back to invest, and that they're, at least in the SIB side, I've been somewhat persuaded that there are, that could provide a catalytic upfront capital at the state level. It's very hard to move in innovation state to state to state, because the investment of your advocacy in every state becomes very expensive. So if there were a system set up for catalytic upfront capital to demonstrate that Youth Build lowers recidivism, benefiting state governments, positioning us to save taxpayers' money and enhance the lives, families, and communities of youthful offenders and change damaging public policies, we definitely want to check it out. Now, the pay for success model for us could allow immediate implementation of Youth Build as a proven solution with no additional cost to taxpayers in the form of profits to investors or a new layer of bureaucracy, but as it's currently described, it creates serious risk to the nonprofit unless upfront capital can be raised that is willing to take the risk, or unless the outcomes that you're reaching for, you're absolutely sure that you can achieve. Next slide, please. So clearly we need, for this to work, a proven solution with measurable return on investment, reliable systems for replication with fidelity to the model and philosophy. That sounds simple. It's very complex, of course, to get people in many different organizations to agree to the same philosophy, to the same outcomes, to the same program design standards, and to actually achieve commonly. And you're going to get some kind of bell curve in terms of the range of success, but your aggregate has to come out and meet this goal. And then highly developed systems for measuring and recording the outcomes and impact. And that means both at the local level, people who are not used to keeping track of everything that they do have to learned the systems, and on the national level, going to have to be able to work very closely with them and support. Next slide, please. Now, these are my questions that I still have. We don't know what will be defined as a reasonable return on the private investment. And so we don't really know if this is a way that private investors are going to find a way to make a profit off the government's responsibility to the people in a way that may not actually be good for taxpayers. So we want to keep track of what is defined as the return. Is it just the return of your capital plus a small percentage of profit, or what is it that will satisfy the investors who want to do social good? Then for the provider, I want to know if we can build in some division of the return on investment between the investor and the nonprofit and the government, so that all three benefit, and that the nonprofit gets some contribution to its cash reserves, which is the hardest thing for a nonprofit to get, and its capacity in return for its success in lowering the cost of government and increasing the returns of the investor. I don't know yet whether this social impact bond would increase the likelihood of taking a solution to full scale to solve the problem, or if the limits of government funding would still limit the impact, and it's just a slightly different way of starting something up, but that we would still reach the limit and still leave the problem unsolved. My goal would be to solve the problems and to find a way to really dramatically change the opportunity structure so that every person born could find a way to fulfill their aspirations with the kind of opportunities they need and deserve. And then finally, how to ensure that the intermediary is actually better at managing the replication process than the government, not just another level of bureaucracy between the government and the provider. Now, we operate as an intermediary in some parts of our work. We're not an intermediary for the Department of Labor, but one really good model in the United States is the model of the Corporation for National and Community Service, which provides funding in a national direct program to national nonprofits that have a model, that are replicating it across the country through affiliates, that hold their affiliates to a high standard, and they get 3 years of funding, and they are refunded only based on the quality of their success in reaching the outcomes that they promised in the previous period. And so that's another way of approaching this. I think it's important that nonprofits be held accountable for their success, their impact, their outcomes, the real difference they make, and that we harness the social entrepreneurial energy that can drive social change in the best way possible. I think it's all interesting and food for thought for all of us. I think that's my opening. Bill, and it's back to you.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. I think we're going to leave those questions right up on the screen as a great way to segue to the Q&A. And I actually have some questions lined up here, so I'm going to direct them to each of the panelists as is appropriate. And the first question I have is for Deborah. And the question is as follows. Deborah, you mentioned the importance of the long-term viability of social impact bonds and pay for success and its related contribution to systemic change. So the question is, what do you think is required in order for service providers to participate in social impact bonds and pay for success financings broadly enough, that is in large enough numbers, to contribute meaningfully to this systemic change? And a second part to that, in your view, is the capacity of social impact bonds and pay for success financings to contribute to systemic change a matter of scale and numbers of participating service providers, or is it something else? So Deborah?
Okay, thanks, Bill. So let me start by echoing what Jeff said earlier about how difficult it is to shift investments or priorities for government and the importance of collaborative advocacy. I think this is an opportunity for providers to work together and move out of their silos, begin to share priorities, and to, I think, advocate collectively. But I keep coming back to the importance of data. And so it's important for not only the individual organization to have the data that supports the outcomes, that tells the story, but I think it's important for industries, meaning the collective provider world, to really have strong data to tell their story. And so I think about the shelter groups in Massachusetts that have been able to demonstrate over time how it's cost-effective to get someone off the street, out of shelter, into supportive housing. And they've invested a lot in capturing that data and working together on a shared policy agenda, and they've advocated locally in Massachusetts. And I think you begin to see movement, and I think and I hope that there will be either a Pay for Success instrument or a SIB there in Massachusetts that will be able to take that effort to scale. But I think it will only be successful if it relies upon the providers working together, sharing that data, and thinking about the outcomes and building their capacity.
Terrific. Thank you, Deborah. The next question I have is for Jeff. Jeff, and actually some of Deborah's comments kind of segue to this question very nicely. Jeff, you mentioned collaboration among service providers in your comments with some emphasis. What sort of collaborative skills do you believe will be required of service providers in order to participate in social impact bond and Pay for Success financing? And secondarily, is there anything about the requirements for social impact bonds and Pay for Success that might present challenges to this collaboration? Jeff?
Yeah, I think a couple thoughts on the first part of the question is that a lot of people assume that collaboration, especially among programs that may often be working towards a common outcome and therefore may have been in the past somewhat as competitors, can happen naturally, but it may take resources to actually have a facilitator to work among the different programs in a collaborative to actually help them develop a concrete action plan and to help them learn the skills of using data collaboratively across, once again, organizations that may not have historically have worked together. And so I think one piece that might need to be considered is that you could need some support and facilitation. The second important piece is defining roles of different partners within a collaborative is absolutely critical. So, for example, who is going to be the facilitator? Who is going to be the person that actually convenes the group on a regular basis? What are the roles of the individual programs that are at the table? What are the expectations around sharing data and being transparent? So really defining in clear terms so that everybody has, in specific a way as possible, an understanding of what the collaborative's purpose is as a whole, but also what their individual role is in the actual work. And then the key there is going to be transparency and the ability to look at data and understand exactly what it's telling an individual program, but the collaborative as a whole about what it may need to do more of because it's already working, but what it may need to do differently, maybe even for specific subpopulations that a specific approach is not exactly working for. And then regarding what requirements may present a challenge, I think it goes back to some of the initial comments, which is that collaborative work like this takes time. There may be an expectation on moving an outcome much faster, and the trust that's needed among programs in order to have impact effectively can be tested by the demands of a limited time frame. And the other piece, which I think goes back to something Dorothy said, which is the amount of the awards. When you're dealing with multiple programs, there can be more resources needed because there are different roles being played by multiple players. And so how can you make sure that what's being done can be scaled fast and effectively if you indeed have the data in hand to make sure that that what you're doing has impact? So those would just be a few initial thoughts.
Thanks, Jeff. That was terrific. The next question I have is for Dorothy. Dorothy, here's your question. If you were a board member of a nonprofit service provider seriously considering participation in a social impact bond or a Pay for Success transaction, what are the three most important strategic or policy questions you would want answers to? And based on that, on those three questions, do you have any recommendations that you might want to offer folks about what sort of board education might be useful for boards to better understand the participation in social impact bonds and Pay for Success financing? Dorothy?
If I were such a board member, I would want to see the documentation that we are really positioned to produce what we're about to promise based on past performance and capacity. I certainly wouldn't want to go in, guessing or praying, as Jeff said. I'd want to know the real financial risks. For example, in a pay-for-success contract, we could be damaged if we don't meet the required metrics. So we'd have to understand that, and I would ask for details about the profit arrangements for the investor in a SIB to make sure I agreed in principle and didn't think the investors were benefiting excessively at public expense. And I would also want to know what's the role of the provider in negotiating the benefits and risks for all players so that the government, the taxpayers, the investors, and the providers all come out with appropriate gains. As for board education, I think I would bring them some materials to read, and I'd bring them some experts to talk to them, and we'd have a lot of discussion.
Fair enough, Dorothy. Thank you very much. We have some other questions here. We have some more time left in the Q&A period, so I'm going to go on to some others. I have one for Jeff. Jeff, this question speaks to the monetization issue. And the question is the following: how do you envision monetizing program impact with the programs with which you work in order to create a cash flow to support an SIB or a PFS transaction?
That's a great question. Honestly, I'm a little bit hesitant to respond in that I have a lot more to learn about social impact bonds myself, but we have been working here locally to establish donor pools that would be focused on very specific outcomes that a community is looking to move. And so the hope would be is that you could get that local investment across multiple funders who may already be funding similar programs in a given area to actually pool some, if not all over time, of their existing dollars towards a collaborative action plan as opposed to a individual action plan, and then to begin to bring the public officials along as well. But our experience so far has been is that in most cases it's private investment that would lead the way in advance of building a public pool to complement that.
Thanks, Jeff. Deborah, the next question is for you here, and there's a specific reference to the slide you showed on reduced costs in other systems of supportive housing. And the question really has two parts: that did that slide and its analysis factor in costs for the public services as the reason that costs were lower? And secondarily, did it factor in the expenditures for services, for supporting services that would need to be added? I guess the question is, is that net of costs for the supportive housing, and just how did you come up with those numbers?
Thank you. Great question. So the pre-supportive housing numbers include systems costs, meaning what's the cost of someone being in jail? What's the cost of someone visiting the emergency room? What's the cost of the police picking someone up off of the street on a regular basis? And what's the cost of shelter? Those are the pre-supportive housing costs. The post-supportive housing costs include both the housing and the services for individuals going into those developments. Does that answer the question?
I believe so. I actually have a question here that may be one that we should give each of the three of you a crack at, and I think you've kind of addressed this in part in some of the comments, but let's pull it all together in this question. So let's start out with Dorothy, and then we'll move on from that. But if you could attack this first, Dorothy. The question is, what questions on metrics would you hope a developer of social impact bonds would look at to determine whether an organization has the capacity to do this type of data-driven work sustainably? There's a lot in that question, Dorothy.
Well, I think I would first want to take a look at what kind of data are they currently collecting and through what methods. And if I ask for the full picture, so for example, if they were asking us, we would be able to give them, over a 15-year period for over 100 programs, for every year, the attendance, the retention, the academic gains, the GEDs and high school diplomas, the job placement, the college placement, and more recently the job and college retention. And we could show them how it had increased and decreased, what it was at every site, what it was in every state, what it was aggregate. So, it's taken a huge investment and commitment over time to be in a position to have data that you can cut in many, many different ways. And so if I were the intermediary talking to me as a provider, I'd want to really look at those systems. I'd want to talk to the people in charge of data management and see what kind of coaching capacity they had for the local programs that we're going to deliver on the ground. And I'd ask them what metrics they thought they were going to measure. Now, I left out recidivism. We also measure recidivism rates. And so, we'd have to look at that data to see whether there was some way of proving that there was going to be a savings to the government through the results of this data.
Thanks, Dorothy. Yeah, it does. Jeff, well, what's your response to that question?
Yeah, I would just build on what Dorothy said. I think those are all great points, and I would just very, very tactically want to be sure that the data sources that are being used can be, that those sources will be sustained over time, that it is not a measure that is, one, difficult to collect, or two, that the systems, for example, the school system or another institution may over time not be willing to collect, especially if some of the data doesn't come out in the direction that everybody had hoped. So ensuring that there's long-term commitment to actually collecting the data, and then ensuring that there is a system in place to gather that data and as many data points as possible so that you can control for as many variables as you can, but also really understand in as fine-tuned a way as possible, realizing the challenges that are always present in doing this kind of measurement in the social sector, but to really understand what may or may not be leading to impact, so that you can practice continuous improvement. So I guess one, ensuring that there is a clear way and a commitment to collecting consistent data over time that is dependable and reliable, and then two, making sure that there's a system in place to collect as many variables as you can to really be able to practice continuous improvement.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Deborah, it's been like 5 minutes since that question was asked. Let me repeat it for you before you try to answer it. Again, the question was, what questions on metrics would you hope a social impact bond or pay for success developer would look at to determine whether an organization has the capacity to do this type of data-driven work sustainably?
Thank you, Bill. I'm not sure I have that much more to add on this subject, but I would just say how important transparency is going to be, and how an organization collects the data. I think Jeff really hammered that. I think an investor is going to want to get comfort knowing that this is something that an organization does on a regular basis, that they have strong systems in place to collect the data. But I'd also say that at the end of the day, this SIB is not going to be the appropriate structure for everyone, because there are going to be instances where the data just does not support the ask. And I think that's important for folks to understand as well.
Very good point. Thank you for adding that, Deborah. I think it looks like we have one more question here, which again may be best answered by each of you independently. So I'll go back and start with Dorothy again. And Dorothy, this question is, what is your experience with legislatures replacing appropriation funding for nonprofit pay-for-performance programs, if any?
I have no experience with pay-for-performance programs. In the past, it has made me nervous because of the risk to the nonprofit and the potential for the government to set standards which might be higher than reality supports. So I have no experience with it except in the situation where it's more of an evaluation after the fact that, okay, you promised to do this, we funded you to do that, did you succeed? Okay, yes, you did succeed, well then we will continue and expand your funding. That is a situation I'm more comfortable with than something which says up front, you know, you incur the cost and we'll only reimburse you if you meet these expectations, unless there are expectations which I know, you know, beyond a doubt that I and all of my extended programmatic networks can meet.
Thank you, Dorothy. Jeff, how about you on that question?
My short answer to the question is I don't have experience in the public sector with that. I'd say that, you know, having experienced working with a few foundations or other local philanthropies that are looking to drive dollars in a almost pay-for-performance kind of way, the issue we've had to wrestle with the most is how much are you committed to impact versus how much are you committed to improvement. So in some of our most successful corporations in the world talk about the importance of failing forward. So demonstrating that you doing something, even if it didn't work, demonstrating that you've learned from it and actually changed practice in order to make sure you have more impact going forward. So I think the biggest question that we'll have to wrestle with, and part of the reason I think social impact bonds are so such a hot item is, or a hot question maybe would be the way to say it, is that we're going to have to figure that out, because there is value in making sure that we aren't just saying you win or you lose, but in value, there is value in promoting, okay, you're actually doing valuable work and you're learning from your successes or your your failures.
Thanks, Jeff. Deborah, how about you? Any experience with legislatures replacing appropriation funding for nonprofit pay-for-performance programs?
So I can share an experience, and a somewhat negative experience actually, without mentioning the community, but we did work in a community to advance an initiative targeting or identifying individuals that were what we call ping-ponging between two systems, the shelter and the jail system, and were able to attract foundation investment. The foundation invested in the initiative, providing service funding for those individuals that we would work with local providers to get into supportive housing. And it was with the understanding that if we hit our outcomes that we said we would, that then the government agency would step in to pick up the program. And the initiative did hit its benchmarks and its outcomes, and at the end of the day, government did not step in. And so when I said earlier, it's really important to understand the role of government and the parameters in which they can fund programs. I think it's in part based on our experience and knowing that things can change over time.
Bill, can I add something?
Absolutely.
This is Dorothy. I think another negative model that I've experienced several times is one where the government takes appropriated funds, runs a competition, you win. In one case, we won $18 million, and you promise to produce something, which we did. We exceeded all of our targets. And then the funding ends, and they run a new competition, and they say, well, we already did you. So the capacity that you've built, the outcomes that you've proven get lost because there's no planning in advance for, well, what are we investing in that we want to sustain over time in order to actually solve a problem. So infrastructure gets built, and then it gets taken apart because these are short-term competitive grants that have no no long-term vision attached to them.
Yeah, it speaks right to the issue of sustainability of the funding flow on that case, and I think that's a great point for you brought up, Dorothy. Thank you for that. And excuse me, actually there was another question that just came in that's somewhat related to this one, so let me offer it up to the group as well. And this is from a state which is going to be piloting a social impact bond program next year. And the issue that's brought up is some nonprofits are worried that what normally would have been appropriated will be out of the budget and replaced with social impact bond funding, and I guess that raises concerns about the the sustainability and kind of the long-term viability, as Deborah mentioned, of social impact bond financing and pay for success financing. Can we try to take that one, Jeff? Is that something that you want to address?
Sure. I guess I would just say that risk certainly is out there. One of our major funders in town, once again, not a public funder, but a private funder, actually, took a phased-in approach and was very transparent about the process that they were going to go through in order to pull together a pooled fund that would support a specific strategy that they were interested in. So they had 10 or 12 individual grantees that they were giving to, and they said, we want to work over the next 3 years to get to a place where we could do pooling with a significant portion of these resources, but we want you to be a part of the plan so that the programs had an opportunity to understand and adjust as opposed to the rug being pulled out from under their feet. And so I think taking an approach like that, if indeed, given these tough economic times, and I can understand why the person would pose this question, especially in these economic times, if that is going to happen, then it would be really critical to do it in a phased approach, in a very transparent approach, and in a way that enables the programs that could be impacted to understand how they could potentially benefit from any new opportunity that emerges and build the capacity in order to make that happen.
That's great, Jeff. Thank you. Deborah, anything to add to that?
No, just to say that I have heard that concern expressed by providers, and yeah, I think it's a possibility. But I think when Jeff talks about transparency, I think that's the appropriate way to look at this. That and years ago I was a government bureaucrat, and I would hope that as government explores these structures, that they'll think about including providers in the conversation and let them be part of planning the implementation so that people don't fall through the cracks.
Thanks, Deborah. And Dorothy, I think you may have answered this question in great part with what you interjected with earlier, but is there anything you'd want to add at this point as we wrap up the Q&A? Terrific. Well, listen, I want to thank my 3 panelists. You guys were absolutely terrific. This was really, really insightful and useful information. Thank also to all of the attendees here and the great questions that you guys provided. We'll end this just by, I mentioned about the ability to find out more information about social impact bonds and pay for success financings on the website. We're just going to flash through a few slides here now to show you. This is, for those of you who haven't seen it, the homepage of the Social Impact Bond Learning Hub website. Shows you the various sections: Learning Out Loud, the Provider Toolkit, Networks and Events. The next slide shows you the slide where where you can become a member to get member-only info as well from the Social Impact Bond Learning Hub website. And the last slide for the service providers is how you can list yourself in the service provider directory. And again, we would encourage you all to visit this website. We update it literally several times a day, and it's a great resource for you on this topic. And with that, we will thank you all for participating and hope you all have a great weekend. Thank you. Bye-bye.